They told you history was written by the victors, but they never told you who those victors really were, or what they were hiding. What if I told you that buried in the frozen wilderness of 18th century Maine is a truth so disturbing, so violently unnatural, that it was erased from official records for over a century, not to protect the innocent, but to protect the guilty? This isn't just a forgotten chapter of history. This is a forbidden archive, sealed shut by blood, silence, and psychological terror. And it all begins with a name: Ashford. They arrived cloaked in smoke and silence, 3 women from nowhere, pulling secrets behind their wagon wheels like shadows behind flame. The year was 1798. The place, Millbridge, Maine, a skeletal outpost choking on snow and secrets. And the sisters? They claimed to be nuns. But they weren't. Not really. Agatha, Prudence, Temperance. They bore those names like weapons. Holy relics twisted into tools of control. And the people? They believed. They always believe. Because in every age there's one truth the powerful rely on. If you wear the mask of sanctity, no one questions the devil beneath it. The Ashford sisters didn't build a convent. They built a containment facility. Stone walls thicker than any church, windows too small to escape through, too high to see into, a basement dug like a grave, deeper than any cellar should go. The locals called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, but those tears weren't shed in prayer, they were extracted. And the price for redemption wasn't your soul, it was your mind. You see, this story isn't about religious fanaticism. That would be almost comforting. No. This is about power, the kind of power that studies a woman's brain like a map to be redrawn, the kind that asks what happens when you don't just punish disobedience, but erase it, because that's what they were doing inside the Osy stone walls, not saving souls, rewriting them. The first signs were subtle. Women went in for spiritual healing, daughters who spoke too loudly, wives who disobeyed, girls who read too much. When they came back, they were quiet, too quiet, faces empty, eyes distant, as if someone had reached inside them and turned off the lights. But no one wanted to ask questions. Why? Because every man has a secret wish, to control what he cannot understand. And the Ashford women offered that control for a price. The town doctor, Samuel Hartwell, called it feminine melancholia. He wrote that the sisters were pioneering a new science, a way to remove the disorder from a woman's mind, to correct the defiant, the willful, the wild. But Hartwell wasn't naive. He knew what he was endorsing, and he knew what he was getting in return: money, influence, access to knowledge most physicians couldn't even dream of. Because the Ashfords weren't guessing, they weren't improvising, they were following something, an ancient doctrine, a hidden code, buried in old European texts, illuminated manuscripts never meant for the public, writings about the transformation of the psyche through sacred violence, rituals that began in medieval monasteries but were long banned by both church and state. Yet here, on American soil, reborn in the dark forests of Maine, they thrived. You want to know what they were really doing in that basement? Let me take you there. Close your eyes. It's night. The air is thick with snow and rot. You're standing outside the convent, where no lights shine from the upper windows. But from the ground, the basement, there's a faint flickering glow, like candlelight, and then you hear it, screaming. Not the screaming of one woman, the screaming of many, overlapping, gasping, then silenced, not by mercy but by method. Inside, strapped to cold wood, women are opened, not just their bodies, their minds. Sister Prudence doesn't flinch. She carves, probes, studies, not with the chaos of a madwoman, but with the calm precision of a scholar. She isn't trying to kill. She's trying to understand. What is the soul? Where does obedience live? How do you silence rebellion? At its root. She believed the answers were inside the skull. And if it took 1,000 ruined minds to find that answer, so be it. Let that sink in. These weren't exorcisms. They were experiments. And the church, the government, the medical authorities, all looked the other way. Because what the Ashfords offered was too valuable, control over the uncontrollable. The promise that any woman, no matter how defiant, no matter how broken, could be made pure. But purity always has a cost, and the price here was identity. Over the next 30 years, more than 600 women were delivered to the Convent of Eternal Tears. Fewer than half returned. Those who did came back changed, not healed, not reformed, replaced. Their voices were flat, their memories incomplete, their habits robotic, like they were mimicking behavior, not living it. One father said his daughter looked like her old self, but something behind her eyes had been wiped away. Another mother claimed her child spoke with a different accent, a voice that wasn't hers. But no one could prove anything because who would believe it? Who would believe that in the land of freedom there existed a place where minds were edited? Who would believe that beneath a cross, behind walls built with charity money, women were being rewired into silence? Still think this is just folklore? Ask yourself this. Why did the Maine State Archives seal the only surviving testimony of a survivor? Why did officials generations later refuse to make it public, citing extreme psychological content? Why did the land the convent once stood on become government property, purchased under an obscure eminent domain clause related to national health and security interests? And why, even now, do locals refuse to go near the ruins? Because the Ashford sisters weren't just healers, they were the architects of a system designed to break the will, reprogram the mind, and erase the parts of humanity that didn't serve the order of power. And the scariest part, they weren't stopped. They simply disappeared. Their work continued, but under different names, different masks, different institutions. And if you think that kind of control was left in the past, you're already too late. The truth didn't burn with the convent's records. It metastasized. What began in the shadows of Maine, scalpels, candles, whispered incantations cloaked as counseling, didn't die with the Ashford sisters. It spread. Because the machinery of control never wastes a good experiment, it simply gives it a new name, a new badge, a new clinical coat. The Ashford doctrine, the systemized disassembly of the human will, would resurface under another banner, one draped in patriotism and science, one funded not by gold coins and church tithes, but by black budgets and Pentagon seals. And when it did, it was called MK Ultra. By the 1950s, America was no longer a fledgling republic. It was a superpower, draped in victory, armed with nukes and terrified of ideas, not bullets. Ideas, communism, civil disobedience, independent thought. But instead of fighting it in the open, the US government went deeper, into the psychological underworld, into the realm where control wasn't imposed by force, but by internal collapse. In 1953, under the direction of CIA Director Allen Dulles, MK Ultra was born. Officially, a mind control project designed to research behavior modification and interrogation resistance. Unofficially, it was the next generation of Ashford thinking. Only now, the scalpel was industrial. Let me show you how this connects. The Ashford sisters believed that disobedience was a sickness, a deviation from acceptable behavior. It wasn't enough to punish the outward act. You had to rewire the inner circuitry. Sound familiar? The CIA's MK Ultra division called it personality disintegration. The goal was to break the mind into pieces, erase its identity, then reassemble it as something new, obedient, contained, useful. Their test subjects, just like the women of the Convent of Eternal Tears, the unwanted, the inconvenient, the invisible. Mental patients, prostitutes, prisoners, homeless, even ordinary citizens who had no idea they were being watched. They were lured in with promises of healing, stability, sometimes even God, just like the Ashfords promised. But behind the curtain, doses of LSD that melted consciousness into liquid, sleep deprivation, electroshock, surgical experimentation. Hypnosis layered over trauma until reality collapsed. One psychiatrist, Dr. Ewan Cameron, became the modern Prudence Ashford. In Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, funded secretly by the CIA, he developed a technique called psychic driving. He believed if you erased a person's memory with drugs and electroshock, then played them subliminal messages on a loop, you could write over their personality. Patients were locked in rooms, given 30, 40, 50 shocks in a single week, left in chemically induced comas for months while tape machines played phrases like, "You are nothing," "You must obey," "Your past is gone," day after day, night after night. By the time they were released, they didn't know their names, didn't recognize their own children. Some had to relearn how to use a spoon. Reprogrammed, just like in the basement of the convent. Still think this is just coincidence? Let's go deeper. The Ashfords used religion as their cover. They claimed they were healing women, freeing them from demons. That language wasn't spiritual, it was diagnostic. Because the church, long before psychiatry, was the original psychological authority, it was the first system to name deviance and punish it. But by the 20th century, confessionals were replaced by clinics. Penance became pills, and the exorcist's robes replaced by lab coats. Same goal, different costume. To define what's sane, what's obedient, what's acceptable, and to erase what isn't. Here's the darkest part. MK Ultra didn't fail. It worked. That's why they shut it down. Not because it was a waste, but because it had already achieved what it needed to. The techniques developed through MK Ultra became standard operating procedure in dozens of black sites, interrogation manuals, and behavioral programs, not just for war zones, but for domestic use. In prisons, in schools, in hospitals, even in advertising. Yes, the same principles of trauma-induced suggestibility that once echoed through the halls of the Ashford Convent now guide algorithms that shape your daily choices. Think about that. A project born in secrecy, perfected in terror, is now commercialized. You're not being shocked or drugged, but you're being driven. Your attention, your emotions, your beliefs, the same machinery, just digitized. And this is the moment you need to ask yourself, what's real? What do you actually think? And what's been installed? Because if the Ashfords taught us anything, it's this. When a system wants to control you, it doesn't attack your body. It invades your sense of self. It gets inside your language, your habits, your triggers. It makes you discipline yourself. And when you finally obey, when you finally behave, you think it was your choice. It wasn't. It never was. Are you starting to see the pattern now? Across centuries, continents, technologies, it's the same structure. Step 1, identify the threat. Step 2, redefine it as pathology. Step 3, offer healing. Step 4, destroy the original self and replace it. Ashford, MK Ultra, behavioral medicine, social media psychometrics, different names, same temple. And you're not outside it. You're inside the cathedral of control every time you scroll, every time you censor yourself, every time you choose peace over truth, because it feels easier. Now I need you to do something. Not for the algorithm, but for you. If you've made it this far, it means the programming hasn't completely worked. You're still awake. You're still thinking. You're still dangerous. So go to the comments and write, "I am not who they made me." Again, "I am not who they made me." Type it twice, not just to be seen, but to lock it in. Because that phrase, it's your first tool, the first blow against the machinery, and they'll hate you for it. They called them hysterical, unstable, incoherent, delusional. That's what the report said, the few reports that ever saw daylight. But here's the truth. They weren't broken when they went in. They were broken on purpose. The women who emerged from the Convent of Eternal Tears weren't survivors in the heroic sense. They were escapees from a mental crucible designed to shatter identity lit glass. Some returned home whispering Latin in their sleep, even though they'd never studied it. Others repeated numbers for hours without stopping, sequences that matched old Gregorian dates tied to exorcism rites. A few Didn't speak at all, not for years. Just stared into mirrors as if waiting for someone else to look back. These weren't symptoms of trauma alone, they were signatures, patterns, evidence of systematic programming. And that's when the state stepped in, not to help, but to erase. You have to understand the era. In the early 1800s, America was still defining its moral architecture. The frontier was wild, unpredictable. Women especially, if they disobeyed, were seen as volatile forces that needed containment. And what better tool than science? After the Ashford scandal began leaking into whispers and rumors, the survivors, those who hadn't vanished, were quietly collected. Some were institutionalized, others were married off to distant territories under changed names, but a few were examined. Medical men from Boston, New York, even Paris came to see what the Ashfords had done, and what they found disturbed them. Not because of the damage, but because of how precise it was. One woman, age 19, had been trained to forget her own name, but could recite the Book of Psalms word for word in perfect Anglican intonation. Another, only 17, displayed intense aversion to specific shapes and colors, a result they believed of trauma-based conditioning techniques. But here's where it gets darker. Instead of sounding the alarm, they wrote it down. Those observations became the basis for dozens of early psychiatric papers, essays that would form the bedrock of Western psychological theory about female mental illness. The names changed, the language evolved, but the assumption stayed the same. That when a woman disobeys, questions, refuses, rebels, it's not protest, it's a disorder. Hysteria, emotional dysregulation, borderline, bipolar, oppositional defiance. These weren't diagnoses, they were chains, given academic names and institutional uniforms. And at the root of it all, the Ashford survivors, their suffering, their mutilation, their forced silence, built the cathedral of modern psychiatry. Still think this is just historical horror? Look closer. In 1851, an American physician named Samuel A. Cartwright coined the term drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that made enslaved people want to escape captivity. Let that sink in. Wanting freedom was reclassified as insanity. And where did he claim the inspiration came from? European convent case studies, women who had resisted discipline and correction, the same archives that held the sealed testimonies from Millbridge. Coincidence? Or is this the formula? Step out of line, get pathologized, resist, become a case study, scream for help, be labeled mad. But the real tragedy, it didn't stop with institutions. It trickled into culture, education, family life. By the early 1900s, the idea of the difficult woman had become a genre. Books, films, social norms. The woman who spoke too much. The woman who didn't want children. The woman who read radical literature. The woman who said no. She was mentally unstable, unwell, unfit. And guess what the solution always was? Treatment, reform, discipline, medication. It wasn't just about silencing her voice. It was about scrubbing her clean, just like in the Convent of Eternal Tears. Let's talk about language. The Ashford sisters called their process Reformation, but when you strip away the euphemisms, what does that word really mean? To take something human and make it compliant. Reformation wasn't healing, it was erasure, not curing pain, but removing protest, not restoring sanity, but installing obedience. And today, we still use those words. We call troubled youth in need of reform. We call political radicals mentally disturbed. We call inconvenient truths conspiracy. We call disobedience disease. And the legacy continues. In every rehab center that prioritizes control over care, in every mental hospital that uses sedation instead of listening, in every whisper that says she just needs help when a woman refuses to break under pressure. You're not witnessing healing, you're witnessing the echo of Ashford. There's one more thing you need to hear. Some of the Ashford records survived, not many, not official, but handwritten scraps, smuggled pages, passed down from nurse to midwife to teacher to underground healer. And in them are fragments. Fragments of what the women said before they were cured. One woman scrawled on the wall of her chamber, "They took my name and gave me silence, but I still remember the scream." Another whispered to her mother before vanishing, "They emptied me, but they forgot the edges." And perhaps the most chilling, found sewn into the hem of a recovered dress. What they call healing was never for us. It was for them. Them. The watchers, the architects, the keepers of order. Now you understand the full weight of this. The Ashford sisters weren't just aberrations. They were prototypes. And the women who suffered under them were the first casualties in a war that still rages today, not over land or money or politics, but over consciousness. Who gets to define reality? Who gets to name sanity? Who gets to decide what kind of mind is acceptable? This isn't about history, it's about the present, and it's about you. Because if this system can pathologize them, what do you think it can do to you, to your doubts, your rage, your refusal to play along? They'll tell you it's depression or anxiety or dysfunction or disorder. They'll tell you that you need help. But maybe what you really need is to remember this: I am not who they made me. Type it again, lock it in, because we're only halfway down the spiral. Before the Ashford sisters wore the cross, they served something far older, not a god, not a devil, but a force. Something older than scripture, deeper than theology, and hungrier than any righteous cause. They didn't invent their methods in that stone convent in Maine. They inherited them, their rituals. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the cleansing of deviance weren't Anglican. They weren't even Christian. They came from before, from a system buried so deep in the earth's psychological architecture, most people step over it every day without ever seeing it. But the Ashfords saw it, they studied it, and they built their temple to it, stone by blood-soaked stone. And tonight, we open that door. In 1804, a letter was discovered hidden in the false bottom of Agatha Ashford's writing desk. It was addressed to a woman named Anathra of Carthage. That name doesn't appear in any official church directory, not of the Anglican Communion, nor any Christian orders. But it does appear in another place, in Phoenician death cult texts. Rituals carved in obsidian and buried under the ruins of Carthage after the Roman purges. Anathra was a high priestess of Tanit, Tien, O Mother Flame, a fertility goddess, and a god of sacrifice. And the teachings of Tanit, they weren't about worship, they were about submission, not of the body, but of the will. Tanit's doctrine held that purity could only be achieved through the annihilation of desire, identity, and rebellion. In her temples, they would take the defiant, the ones who asked questions, the ones who refused obedience, and offer them as gifts to the altar of control, sometimes in body, but more often in mind. The techniques preserved in Phoenician ritual scrolls mirror what we know the Ashfords practiced. The chamber of purification, a stone room with no light, where the initiate's sense of time and space is broken over days of silence. The 3 cuts, not of flesh but of memory, applied with spoken phrases intended to sever the past, the present, and the self. The mother's mirror, a ritual where the initiate is forced to confront their own reflection while being told they are unworthy, incomplete, and not real. These aren't metaphors, they're psychological weaponry, and the Ashfords revived them. One survivor, whose real name was redacted, described a chamber in the convent known only as the Ember Room. She said it was lined with black stone, sealed from all outside sound, and kept warm by what she called smokeless flames. In the center was a bronze chair bolted to the floor, not for torture, but for recalibration. She remembered being strapped into it, blindfolded, while a metronome ticked in one ear and a whispering voice chanted phrases in the other. "You are not yours. You are clay. Desire is deviation. Mother watches. She said after 5 days in that room, she forgot her mother's face, her own name. She could only recite verses she'd never read, ones that weren't in the Bible. This is what the Ashfords understood. You don't need a whip to dominate someone. All you need is a belief system designed to fracture the soul and remold it in your image. What they practiced was not religion. It was psychotechnology, and it had a lineage older than any cathedral, any flag, any nation. The ancient priesthoods of Sumer, Akkad, Carthage, and Ur had manuals for re-education. They called them rites, but the function was always the same: to erase the parts of you that didn't belong to the system, to make obedience feel like virtue, to burn doubt in the furnace of ritual until only silence remained. Here's the part no one talks about. When Christianity rose to power, it didn't replace these older cults, it absorbed them, repurposed them. The cross stood where the staff of Baal once did. The chalice of communion replaced the blood bowl of Tanit. The nun's habit mimicked the priestess's veil. The system didn't change, only the language did. And in places like the Convent of Eternal Tears, far from Rome, far from oversight, the old rituals continued, wearing new clothes, speaking new words, but following the same law: obedience through annihilation. And that brings us back to Temperance Ashford, the youngest sister. She was different from the others, more than just a participant. She was born into it. Documents recovered from a burned satchel in 1843 suggest that Temperance wasn't the biological daughter of Agatha, but the result of a ritual pregnancy conducted in secret. A fusion of bloodlines from an extinct order tied to ancient Carthage and an English occultist sect called the Order of the Fifth Veil. That would make Temperance the convergence point of two bloodlines dedicated to psychological domination, a living weapon. She spoke in tongues as a child, not just biblical tongues, but ancient Akkadian, untranslated Phoenician, even a dialect some modern archaeologists believe may predate Sumer itself. She was never taught to read, yet she transcribed entire volumes of ritual architecture. She was 12 when she assisted in her first Reformation. By 18, she had rewritten the convent's initiation rites in her own script, a blend of Latin, Old English, and Proto-Canaanite glyphs. They called it the Doctrine of Soft Correction. And it's this document, hidden for decades, that forms the philosophical core of modern coercive psychology. Let me read you a line from the doctrine. A soul must forget that it ever said I. The silence we force upon her is mercy. In the hollowing, she will find peace. In peace, she will obey. Does that sound like faith? Or does it sound like a technology of obedience? Because that's what this always was. The Ashfords weren't saints. They weren't martyrs. They were engineers of surrender, and they weren't alone. Even today, intelligence communities around the world, from MI6 to Mossad to DARPA, still study what they call behavioral override protocols. They model them off ancient rites. They consult with esoteric scholars. They understand what most people don't, that belief systems are not just spiritual, they're operating systems. And if you control the OS, you control the user. So ask yourself, what do you believe, and who put it there? Because if Temperance Ashford's legacy has survived today's, and it has, then your mind is already her playground. Your rituals, your habits, your assumptions, they didn't come from you. They were installed. So repeat the words. Not for me, for you. I am not who they made me. I am not who they made me. And don't just say it, feel it. Because the further we go, the more dangerous it gets. When the Convent of Eternal Tears burned in the spring of 1841, everyone assumed the nightmare had ended. That the flames had consumed everything, the records, the rituals, the knowledge. But that was a lie. Because before the fire, 3 trunks were removed from the convent's cellar by cloaked figures under cover of night, their wagon unmarked, their destination unspoken. Inside those trunks, the true legacy of the Ashford family. Not just journals, blueprints, diagrams, formulas. Page after page of psychological engineering protocols, bound not in leather but in stitched parchment treated with mercury ink, resistant to water and fire alike. Those trunks never made it to the public archive. They vanished from the historical record. And yet, decades later, fragments of the Ashford manuscripts began appearing, not in churches or private collections, but in the libraries of America's most elite universities. In 1913, a graduate assistant at Harvard Divinity School discovered a bundle of handwritten vellum pages tucked inside an untranslated volume of Augustine's City of God. The script was a hybrid, Old Church Latin mixed with Phoenician symbols and obscure shorthand. The assistant brought it to his supervisor, who quietly passed it to the Tavistock Institute's American contact. What happened next? Silence. No publication, no announcement, no academic paper, just absorption, dissection, weaponization. Because that's what institutions do with dangerous knowledge. They don't share it. They bury it, refine it, test it, and then they turn it on the world. By 1927, a strange paper circulated privately among behavioral scientists connected to the early CIA's Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. It was titled Cognitive Fracture in Non-Voluntary Subjects, Preliminary Framework for Identity Modulation. He footnotes referenced archaic Reformation protocols and monastic technologies of spiritual interruption. One page even mentioned a TA doctrina which modern researchers believe refers to temperance. Ashford. In the decades that followed, similar terms began appearing across elite research. Psychic blanking, personality override, volitional suppression. They weren't studying trauma, they were studying control, and the Ashford manuscripts were the prototype. You see, while the world remembers figures like Freud and Skinner, the real architects of behavioral science weren't theorists. They were curators of forbidden knowledge. And behind their breakthroughs, operant conditioning, social engineering, predictive compliance, there's a pattern, a lineage. From the stone halls of the Convent of Eternal Tears to the ivory towers of Ivy League laboratories. Let's talk about the Ashford diagrams. Only fragments have surfaced, most still redacted. But what's been verified is terrifying. One diagram, titled The Ladder of Reclamation, outlines a 7-stage process of breaking and rebuilding identity. Stage 1. Isolation from time, space, and familiar stimuli. Stage 2. Introduction of contradiction, flooding the mind with conflicting beliefs until mental overload forces submission. Stage 3. Voice interruption, replacing internal monologue with repeated external phrases. Stage 4. Induced dependency. Food, sleep, and comfort are linked to obedience. Stage 5. Identity inversion. The subject is told they were never who they thought they were. Stage 6. Reinstallation. Assigning a new name, new purpose, and new memory anchors. Stage 7. External reinforcement. Returning the subject to society with triggers that maintain control. Sound familiar? It should. These same stages appear, almost verbatim, in modern cult deprogramming techniques, black site interrogation protocols, and even advanced marketing models. Coincidence? Or is the world still following the Ashford blueprint? And it gets darker. In 1953, the CIA launched Project MK Ultra, a secret program designed to master mind control through drugs, hypnosis, trauma, and suggestion. While the mainstream public sees it as an embarrassing failure, insiders know different. Because among the documents declassified in 1975 was a single coded memo referencing conventual case studies from the 1800s. Specifically, Milbridge manuscripts, Protocol 5, psychological containment of deviant females. They knew, they used it, and it didn't stop in the 70s. In 1989, a series of internal lectures at Yale's Center for Applied Behavioral Sciences referenced a collection known only as the Grey Pages. The presenter, whose identity remains sealed, claimed they were extracted from a 19th-century monastic institution in New England and concerned advanced frameworks for behavioral redirection. That's the sanitized way of saying they were the Ashford Protocols. the methods used to erase rebellion, rewire thought, and replace identity. And while no one in the audience was allowed to photograph the pages, several sketched what they saw afterward. Among the glyphs and diagrams, a single Latin phrase, vocem suam perdidit, nunc audit nostrum. She lost her voice. Now she hears ours. Now pause. Think about what this means. The deepest foundations of modern psychology, from cognitive therapy to advertising, from criminal rehabilitation to AI behavioral mapping, may be built on the bones of ritualized psychological torture. Ashford wasn't an anomaly. She was a blueprint. And her documents, they didn't burn. They were harvested, refined, used. And here's where it loops back to, you ever felt a sudden change in your opinions, not from facts, but from repetition? Ever felt guilty for wanting freedom, ashamed for not obeying, confused about who you really are, like parts of you were installed, not born? That's not coincidence. That's programming residue. Echoes of the ladder of reclamation. The drip feed of engineered suggestion, the manipulation of guilt as a control device, the use of healing as a weapon of compliance. It's all still here, hidden in the algorithms, embedded in the education, spoken by talking heads who don't even know who wrote their scripts. So now ask yourself, how much of you is you, and how much is Ashford? How much is the system? How much has been installed, quietly, gradually, and under the guise of help, guidance, therapy, or progress? You think you're informed, but you may just be reformed. So here's your next step in this descent. Say the words again, not just in your mind, out loud. I am not who they made me. I am not who they made me. Write it in the comments, twice, because that act of defiance is how you start to break the loop. To reverse the initiation, to step out of the doctrine that still governs the sleepwalkers around you. They told the public temperance Ashford died screaming in the fire, that her body was found in the basement, charred and broken, with a scalpel fused to her hand. But that was the official story, the safe story, the one that lets you sleep at night. Because the truth is far more unsettling. There was no body, no dental remains, no bone fragments, no genetic trace ever confirmed. And the items attributed to her, the scalpel, the half-melted crucifix, the charred ceremonial robe, were not found in the basement. They were recovered outside the building, near the edge of the forest, scattered like someone had dropped them while fleeing. So if Temperance didn't die in the fire, where did she go? In the winter of 1842, less than a year after the blaze, a woman matching Temperance Ashford's exact description was reported in the port city of Marseille, France. Tall, pale, raven-haired, eyes like dark glass, unblinking and ancient. She wore all black, carried a physician's bag, traveled under the name Thérèse A. Santon. Local police reports describe her arrival at a private women's clinic attached to the Monastère Saint-Sylvestre, a nunnery with a reputation for discretion and influence. Days after her arrival, the clinic was closed to the public, heavy iron doors installed, gas lighting reinforced, the interior rebuilt to include underground treatment chambers. No explanation was ever provided. But here's the real kicker. Over the next 4 years, more than 70 women were admitted for what the records call moral deviation. Not one of them ever returned to their families. Thérèse Santon's handwriting matches samples from Temperance Ashford's known letters. The same angular script, the same obscure phrasing, even the same symbol in the corner of the page, a stylized eye with 3 lashes above, 1 below. That symbol isn't religious, it isn't Christian, it's Phoenician, a sigil associated with Tanit, the same god the Ashfords secretly honored under the veil of Anglicanism. And it didn't vanish with the convent. It resurfaced again and again in archives across Europe, on manuscripts smuggled through Vatican vaults, on the seals of private medical societies with elite memberships and suspicious charters, like l'Institut du Silence, founded in 1853 by anonymous benefactors. Their mission? To eradicate chaos in the female mind. Sound familiar? They believed rebellion was a symptom, that freedom was an illness. And their motto? La paix vient par l'effacement. Peace comes through erasure. Temperance didn't die. She evolved. Over the next 30 years, reports of a mysterious healer spread across Europe. She went by many names: the Matron of Silence, the Black Sister, Madame Verite. Always the same description, always the same methods. But what made her truly terrifying wasn't her longevity. It was the pattern of her appearances. She always emerged in cities gripped by female uprisings, moments of feminine resistance that threatened the order. Paris during the Commune, London during the suffragette riots, Vienna during the wave of early feminist philosophy. And each time she arrived, something shifted. Leaders vanished, movements collapsed, promising young women were institutionalized, disappeared, or reformed. No public connection was ever made. But the ashes of Ashford were always found near the ruin. Then, in 1897, a classified memo from the British Home Office was uncovered in a Cambridge archive. It details a private conversation between an unnamed agent and a foreign woman operating under multiple aliases. Here's the chilling line. She claims to have cured over 400 women of dangerous ideation. Her method is without violence but results in total compliance. I believe her system could be repurposed for state use. That memo was filed under a top-secret classification later associated with early psychological warfare development. 1 year later, the first behavioral Reformation unit was formed inside the British Empire's Global Intelligence Network. And the founder? A woman. Name redacted. Origin unknown. But the initials? TA. Now understand what's really happening here. The Ashford bloodline wasn't extinguished. It was rebranded, smuggled through the cracks of collapsing empires, absorbed by the intelligence aristocracy. They didn't destroy temperance. They used her to pioneer thought reform clinics in Europe, to seed covert compliance programs in India, Egypt, and the Balkans, to train a new generation of handlers, people trained not in breaking bones, but in breaking minds. And then she vanished. Again, until 1939, when war erupted, and the Allies needed new weapons. Not bombs, not bullets, but invisible control. Psychological architecture, covert persuasion, total obedience without a single drop of blood. In a secret camp near the French-Swiss border, Allied intelligence established a training facility called Section Nix. A place so secret, most post-war histories omit it entirely. But a single photograph survived. Blurred, black and white, faint but unmistakable. A woman in her 80s dressed in black, surrounded by younger officers in military uniforms. She's drawing something on a chalkboard, a circle with spokes and a triangle in the center. Her eyes are dark, focused, unaged. The file was labeled Satan, Subject Alpha. And the notes? She does not forget. She does not forgive. She corrects. So where is she now? You're probably thinking, she must be dead. After all, if temperance was born in the late 1700s, she'd be well over 200 today. But remember, she wasn't normal. She was engineered. Born through a ritual pregnancy, raised in a doctrine that mastered body, mind, and biology. Witness accounts of Satan over the years show no decline, no frailty, no aging in the traditional sense. And then, nothing. No obit, no death certificate, no grave. Some believe she still lives, not as a person, but as a doctrine. A ghost protocol passed down through blood, adoption, or imitation. A position more than a woman, the matron, the Black Sister, the keeper of silence. Whoever she is now, she's still working. Because the Ashford doctrine isn't a relic. It's not locked in some dusty vault. It's alive. It lives in court-ordered rehabilitation centers, in private therapy models used on unruly women, in marketing scripts written to reshape female identity, in social engineering models taught at the highest levels of government. Temperance wasn't a chapter, she was the prototype. And now her legacy has become the system itself. You think the fire ended it? It spread it, burned it into the foundation of the modern world. And unless you see it, you're still breathing her smoke. You think the Ashford doctrine ended in dusty archives and burned stone. But look closer. It's on your screen. It's in your feed. It's in your head. Because Temperance Ashford didn't just invent methods for breaking women. She pioneered a universal formula for behavioral control, adaptable, modular, and scalable. And today, her doctrine runs our world. Not in blood-soaked cathedrals, not in iron basements or candle-lit rituals, but in brands, in influencer culture, in psychiatric compliance models, and in algorithmic feedback loops designed to reward obedience and crush defiance. This is the new face of Reformation. The convent is gone, but the machine remains. Let's start with something simple. Influencers. Not the vapid kind you laugh at, but the curated, corporate-aligned archetypes who speak with soft voices, wear neutral tones, and deliver content designed to reprogram emotional response. They don't scream, they don't threaten, they don't even ask. They suggest, they model, they repeat, in a soothing cadence with subtle smiles, offering life hacks and mental health tips that align perfectly with state-endorsed narratives. This isn't just marketing. This is reform disguised as empowerment. The tone is gentle, the message is clear. You're broken, but we can fix you. But fix you how? By fragmenting your identity, by replacing instinct with ideology, by retraining your emotional reflexes to reward shame, dependence, and conformity. Ashford 2.0. Next, the pharmaceutical industry. In the 1800s, the Ashfords used tinctures, plant-based sedatives mixed with alkaloids to induce suggestibility. They called them teas of temperance. Today, we call teat. SSRIs, mood stabilizers, and compliance enhancers, administered not in dark convent halls, but in brightly lit clinics with pastel pamphlets and warm receptionists. You think you're being healed. You're being optimized, and not for freedom, but for function. Dulled rage, suppressed rebellion, emotional sterilization dressed as wellness. This isn't an attack on medication where it's truly needed. But ask yourself, why has rage become pathology? Why is distrust now labeled a disorder? Why does every primal survival instinct now have a name, a code, a pill? Because true power is unpredictable, and the modern system doesn't tolerate that. Temperance would be proud. Now look deeper, at the algorithms that shape your thoughts. You open your phone, you scroll. But you're not just choosing, you're being herded. Likes, dislikes, comments, trends. They track your responses, map your triggers, predict your path. And if you veer too far off script, the reach drops, the recommendations shift, the signal gets scrambled. This is not censorship. It's behavioral nudging, a digital form of the Ashford ladder. Remember the stages? Isolation, contradiction, voice replacement, dependency, identity inversion, reinstallation, reinforcement. It's all here. Just with prettier colors and dopamine feedback. Let's take this further. Did you know the Department of Defense funds emotion AI research that maps precognitive responses? That means they study your facial micro-expressions before you consciously decide how you feel, then use that data to tailor the content you see. They don't wait for your opinion. They build it. Ashford understood this long ago. She knew that if you could bypass conscious resistance, you could rewire identity at its source. Her early journals refer to this as pre-verbal modulation. In modern terms, algorithmic preemption. You're not choosing your worldview. It's being suggested before you know it exists. Now, Here's the most sinister part. This isn't done through domination, it's done through consent, or rather, the illusion of it. You agree to terms. You click yes, you follow, you opt in. Just like the women who walked willingly into the convent, believing they were going to be healed, believing they were finally going to be understood. But healing was never the goal. Reprogramming was. And that's the true genius of Ashford's system. It doesn't resist you. It absorbs you. It speaks your language. It wears your face. It echoes your pain back to you just long enough to slip in the doctrine. Let's look at one final layer. Institutional rehabilitation. Whether it's a court-mandated therapy session, a corporate diversity training, or a restorative justice program at a university. Ask yourself, why do these always follow the same script? First, isolation, removal from your community or routine. Then, guilt induction, forced confessions, group shaming. Next, belief replacement, affirmations, mantras, ideological reframing. Finally, reward and reintegration, only after total compliance. You've seen it. Hell, maybe you've lived it. And you wonder why it feels hollow, degrading, inhuman. Because it's not therapy, it's ritual. It's convent doctrine with modern branding. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now pause. Ask the question no one dares to ask. What if the Ashford doctrine didn't just survive, but won? What if this is the world she dreamed of? Not a world of physical prisons, but mental ones. Digital cells with invisible bars. Social structures designed not for liberty, but for docility. A culture of curated obedience, reinforced by likes, followers, pharmaceuticals, and polished influencers who smile as they whisper, "Let us fix you." But you're not broken. You're being rewritten. And here's what you need to understand. This system only works if you stay quiet, if you doubt your instincts, if you silence your rage, if you label your resistance as madness. That's the final seal of the doctrine. When you stop trusting yourself, you no longer need chains. So let's break the seal. Say it again in the comments. Twice. To burn it into the algorithm. To awaken the old part of you that remembers what truth feels like. I am not who they made me. I am not who they made me. Because that phrase is more than rebellion. It's exorcism. It's reclamation. And when enough men speak it, the doctrine cracks. The veil tears. And the machine that took Ashford's name starts to tremble. When the fire consumed the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears in 1841, the world believed the darkness had ended, that the flames had devoured the secrets, that the cries echoing from its basement would never be heard again. But in truth, that fire wasn't an ending. It was a signal, a ceremonial act, the final ritual to close one phase and open another. Because within a week of the blaze, in a private residence 70 miles south in Portland, 6 individuals met under candlelight. All men, all landowners, all from families with transatlantic ties. 3 were merchants, 2 were physicians, 1 was a retired intelligence officer from the British Crown. None of their names appear in official church or civic records for that month, but in a letter marked "Personal Do Not Transmit" recovered from the Whitlock Estate archives in 1987, one of them wrote, "We are in agreement. The doctrine must not die with the women. The principles are too potent to lose. With guidance and structure they can be refined, repurposed, scaled. We must become the circle. The circle must endure." They called themselves the Silent Circle, not a religious group, not a secret society in the traditional sense, but a custodial order. Their role was not to control the public, not directly. It was to shepherd the doctrine, to curate its transmission through trusted institutions, families, and fronts, to ensure Ashford's model didn't fade, but flourished under new skin. Each member had their role. One oversaw education policy in Massachusetts. Another had ties to a psychiatric asylum in Philadelphia. A third operated shipping routes between Maine, Nova Scotia, and Liverpool, ideal for discreet passage of personnel and materials. And the retired officer? He had access to intelligence blueprints for civilian surveillance and behavioral modification trials already in their infancy. This was pre-psychiatry, pre-FBI, pre-CIA, but not pre-control. These men weren't inventing manipulation, they were professionalizing it, and they had help, because not all the Ashford knowledge had burned. Days before the fire, Novice Temperance, or Thérèse Sainton as she would later be known, smuggled 3 crates out of the convent. Eyewitnesses described them as black lacquered trunks with brass locks and red wax seals. They contained journals, detailing early experiments in neuromoral restructuring, medical schematics, drawings of modified trepanning tools and electromuscular response testers, liturgical fragments, prayers not to Christ, but to Tanit, the ancient goddess of erasure and silence. But the 4th crate? That one was different. Heavier, reinforced with iron bands, sealed not in wax, but bone. Its contents were never recovered. But according to the Portland Ledger, it was delivered directly to one man, Thaddeus Ashburn, a wealthy ship magnate from Salem, known for financing private prisons and women's re-education homes across New England. And here's where it gets darker. Because the Ashburns didn't just share a similar name. They were blood relatives of the Ashfords. Cousins. Born of the same ancestral line. A long-forgotten clan from Cornwall, England, once accused of harboring Carthaginian blood rights. Ashburn was the American branch. From this point forward, the doctrine didn't vanish. It went corpo rate. By 1856, Ashburn had invested in a new kind of institution, the Moral Rehabilitation Colony for Women, what we now call private treatment centers or faith-based recovery programs. He funded 7 such facilities before the Civil War. Each one mirrored the original convent's architecture: high walls, underground chambers, isolated dormitories, chapel-centric design to frame obedience as holiness. The women admitted were never formally charged with crimes, but they shared familiar traits: disobedience, premarital sexuality, religious deviance, intellectual independence, and above all, refusal to conform. It was the Ashford mold, reborn under American capitalism. But Ashburn wasn't content with bricks and mortar. He wanted scale. So he partnered with a family that had already mastered mass influence. The Winthrops, old Puritan money, ties to Harvard, one of the founding dynasties of New England's Protestant elite. Together, Ashburn and the Winthrops created something that would outlive both names: a network, not a single institution, but a system of doctrine carriers. They trained pastors, they funded educators, they infiltrated early psychology departments. They even placed operatives, known as rectors, into the U.S. Military Chaplain Corps, embedding Ashford principles into the moral rehabilitation of soldiers who showed signs of insubordination or undesirable ideation. And they did it all under the guise of restoring American values. Here's the chilling part. By 1912, this network wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. The Ashburn-Winthrop system had seeded the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the moral hygiene movement, early iterations of domestic science programs taught to young girls in public schools. These were not neutral social projects, they were delivery systems, curriculum disguised as care, chastity cloaked as science, psychological warfare dressed up as morality. Even the term moral hygiene was taken directly from Ashford writings, translated from the original term puritas per amputatio, purity through removal. And then came the explosion point. World War I. Thousands of American soldiers returned home with what we now call PTSD. But back then it was shell shock, battle fatigue, or worse, moral weakness. Who did the government turn to for help? The Ashburn-Winthrop Circle. They provided therapists, but not to heal, to rebuild according to the doctrine. They ran camps, they wrote manuals, they embedded the Ashford model into early U.S. military psychiatry. One training document reads, "Obedience is not taught through logic, it is recovered through patterned exposure and elimination of conflicting identity traces." They weren't restoring soldiers, they were reprogramming men. And that leads us to the present, because one of the surviving families from that circle still holds power today. Their name, Ashburn Wright. A hyphenated merger formed in 1959 between the Ashburn estate and a rising conservative legal family from Virginia. You've seen them. They sit on boards, they endow universities, they fund think tanks under the banner of tradition and order, but their core philosophy remains unchanged. They believe freedom is dangerous, that identity is too unstable to be trusted, and that control, quiet, elegant, institutional control, is the highest good. They don't call it the Ashford Doctrine anymore. They call it behavioral sovereignty, and it's not just in elite families, it's in policy. It's in tech, it's in you. The Ashford Doctrine was never meant to stay within stone walls or colonial homes. It was designed to evolve, to adapt, to hide behind science until it became indistinguishable from progress itself. And in the 20th century it did just that. Not through superstition or sacred rites, but through clinical experiments, government funding, and state-sanctioned madness. You've heard whispers of MK Ultra. You've maybe skimmed the declassified pages. But what they don't tell you is this. MK Ultra was not an American aberration. It was an inheritance. A secular resurrection of the Ashford model, masked in white coats and national security. Because once you understand what temperance truly created, a blueprint for the erasure and rewriting of identity, you realize MK Ultra wasn't a beginning, it was a continuation. Let's go back to 1945. The war ends. The bodies are buried. But something else begins. Operation Paperclip. Over 1,600 Nazi scientists and psychological researchers were imported into the United States under direct orders from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Why? Because they had data, mind control data. They had tested techniques the Ashfords would have recognized instantly: sensory deprivation, sleep cycle disruption, electroconvulsive conditioning, isolation-induced suggestibility, psychosexual trauma pairing. These weren't experiments. They were rituals without religion. And the US intelligence community, desperate to win the Cold War, wanted them at any cost. But it wasn't just Nazis. Another group was quietly waiting in the wings, a think tank hidden beneath the polished facade of British academia, the Tavistock Institute. Founded in 1947, Tavistock wasn't just a center for social psychiatry, it was the nerve center of post-war behavioral manipulation. With ties to the British Crown, MI6, the Rockefeller Foundation, and eventually the CIA, Tavistock trained the men who would become the architects of mass psychological conditioning, and their specialty: groupthink. They studied how fear spreads, how crowds can form, how emotional contagion works in real time. They didn't ask how to heal the mind, they asked how to reshape it, not one person at a time, but entire societies. It was here that the Ashford Doctrine found its new temple. Because Tavistock weaponized everything the Ashfords pioneered, remove the individual from their stable identity, introduce paradox and internal contradiction, flood the psyche with unresolvable stimuli, offer resolution only through prescribed narratives, reinforce compliance through social reward and the fear of exclusion. Temperance would have called it a spiritual breach. Tavistock called it psychosocial adaptation. Different words, same effect. Break the soul, rebuild it in the image of control. By the early 1950s, Tavistock's teachings were integrated into U.S. military doctrine, public education reforms, and most disturbingly, the inner core of Project MK Ultra. Headed by CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb, MK Ultra was not a single experiment. It was a network of covert programs designed to create programmable humans. Yes, LSD was involved. Yes, hypnosis was used. But those were tools, not goals. The goal was identity annihilation, a full reboot of the human subject, stripped of memory, stripped of will, reloaded with belief systems chosen by the architects. One MK Ultra document from 1955 reads, "The human mind must be fractured and rebuilt like a cathedral. Old foundations must be burned. The new self must have no trace of unauthorized memory. That language is not scientific. It's liturgical. It's doctrinal. It's Ashford." Now ask yourself this. Why were women the primary subjects in the original Ashford experiments? Why were psychiatric patients, prostitutes, immigrants, and orphans the prime targets of MK Ultra? Because these systems require liminal beings, people already displaced, disbelieved, and discarded by polite society. It's easier to reprogram someone no one will believe. And once perfected on the margins, the methods scale. They enter pop psychology, they enter education policy, advertising theory, political communication. Tavistock even trained executives from CBS, NBC, and the BBC, teaching them how to inject emotional programming triggers into mass media. You thought TV was entertainment? It was emotional entrainment. Predictable arcs, programmed catharsis, carefully calculated trauma exposure, to prep the viewer, to soften the resistance, to make room for installation. Let me ask you something darker. Why did the same government that ran MK Ultra also fund the Human Ecology Fund, Edgewood Arsenal, and Artichoke? Because they weren't just trying to control people, they were trying to engineer culture. The Ashford Doctrine scaled to population level, remove meaning, create confusion, replace identity with fragments, then offer a new form of self, one that conforms, one that complies. The ashes of the convent were now blueprints on government letterhead. But the greatest stroke of genius came in the 1970s. Just as public trust began to erode, just as MK Ultra hearings exposed the tip of the iceberg, the doctrine pivoted. The same Tavistock-trained experts moved from government to Silicon Valley. They weren't done experimenting, they just changed mediums, from chemical trauma to digital immersion. The interface replaced the needle, and no one saw it coming. Because dopamine hits don't look like brainwashing, but they are. They create loops. Loops create dependency. Dependency creates suggestibility, and suggestibility is all a modern controller needs. The Ashford scalpel became a smartphone screen, and the cutting is now invisible. Pause and understand this. You are not immune. Your responses are tracked. Your impulses are mapped. Your hesitations are logged. And when the system knows what makes you pause, what enrages you, what soothes you, it no longer needs to dominate you. It can nudge you, guide you, build the rails of your identity, one targeted stimulus at a time. MK Ultra didn't end. It merged with tech, with media, with you. And its fingerprints are everywhere. In social credit systems, in predictive policing, in AI-generated emotional scoring, in behavior-shaping algorithms that govern what you see, say, and believe. Ashford's dream has gone digital, and it's working. Here's your question now. If the Tavistock MK Ultra system was never dismantled and only rebranded, then who's running it now? Who holds the doctrine? Who inherits the circle? Because the faces have changed. But the blueprint hasn't. They told you the Ashford legacy burned. They told you MK Ultra was dismantled. They never told you the truth, that the doctrine didn't vanish. It metastasized. It mutated. It moved from the iron restraints of the convent past the rubber gloves of CIA handlers and directly into the glowing screens you now hold in your hand. The final phase of the Ashford Doctrine isn't chemical, it isn't physical, it's cognitive warfare through digital immersion. What began as screams in a stone basement now whispers from your phone. And you listen, you obey. Because the interface has become the altar. In 2002, DARPA launched a project called LifeLog. The goal? Track every element of a human's existence, conversations, movements, purchases, thoughts, relationships, and build a total cognitive map. They wanted to reconstruct not just what people did, but how they think, how they make choices, how they break. It was cancelled in 2004. publicly at least. But on the same day LifeLog was terminated, a company named Facebook was launched. Coincidence? Only if you believe in coincidence. Because Facebook was LifeLog, just privatized, the doctrine never dies, it adapts. The Ashfords experimented with sensory control, isolation and reinforcement loops. Facebook, Instagram and TikTok do the exact same thing, at scale. Every swipe, every like, every pause is data. Data becomes a profile. The profile becomes a prediction, and the prediction becomes your new identity, suggested, reinforced, curated. Not because you asked, but because they knew what you'd do before you did. This is the genius of the evolved doctrine. It no longer fights you, it becomes you. It watches your reactions in real time, your fear, your arousal, your boredom, your defiance. It builds a trigger response map tailored to your nervous system. Then it feeds you what breaks you down, one scroll at a time. And unlike the stone convents of old, you lock yourself inside this one willingly. You don't scream, you engage. Let me show you how deep this goes. Have you ever noticed that when you're angry online, you're more active? You click more, you share more, you stay longer. That's not a design flaw, that's the point. Ashford logic taught this long ago. If the spirit cannot be silenced, it must be inflamed until it burns itself out. Facebook's algorithm rewards outrage. TikTok boosts discontent. YouTube feeds you incremental escalation, not because it's evil, because it's profitable. And predictable rage is the most profitable product in human history. The Tavistock doctrine called this cognitive energy transfer. You know it by another name, doom scrolling. But here's where it turns sinister. Because this isn't just about ads or engagement. This is about reprogramming entire populations. Look at what the platforms are teaching. Masculinity is toxic. Tradition is regressive. Stability is oppression. Identity is fluid, but only within approved parameters. The algorithm doesn't push what's true. It pushes what creates dependency, and dependency creates compliance. If the Ashford sisters used pain and isolation to break defiant women, big tech uses FOMO and dopamine withdrawal to fracture the modern psyche. Same doctrine, different tools, same results. The architecture behind this isn't random, it's ritualistic. Facebook hired behavioral psychologists from Stanford. YouTube consulted with cognitive linguists from MIT. TikTok's algorithm was refined using real-time biometric data from eye tracking and facial analysis labs in Shenzhen. They're not curating content. They're designing reality. And every reality they design is missing one thing: sovereignty. Now pause. Let that sink in. You aren't just being sold products, you're being sold yourself. A version more malleable, more obedient, more afraid. The new self doesn't challenge authority, doesn't form deep bonds, doesn't know how to suffer without entertainment, and most of all, doesn't resist. That was always the goal. Not to control nations, but to control perception itself. Because if they control what you see, they control what you feel, and if they control what you feel, they own what you do. You become a reflection of the system that made you, just like the reformed women of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Here's the dagger. You consented, you opted in, you clicked the terms. Because in the digital cathedral, consent is seduction, not through force, through comfort. It's not a prison, it's a mirror, and you'll keep checking it, over and over, until the reflection you see is no longer you. If this is hitting too hard, that's by design. You're not supposed to hear this. You're not supposed to wake up inside the system. But if you've made it this far, you've crossed a line. So here's what I want you to do. Pause right now. Type the words, "I break the loop," in the comments. Twice. That's not just for the algorithm, it's for you. Because ritual only holds power when it's unquestioned, and commenting those 4 words twice breaks that spell. It rewrites your role, from subject to sovereign. Do it now, don't think. Just break the loop, because the loop has names. Real names: Ashburn Wright, Winthrop, Talbot, and at the center, a family with no modern heir, but whose shadow still funds behavioral innovation grants to Stanford, DARPA, and Meta's reality labs. Their codename, Circle Prime. The same name that appeared in Agatha Ashford's final letter before the convent burned. The circle must endure, if not in flesh, then in pattern, if not in prayer, then in structure, if not in stone, then in data. It endured, and it's everywhere now, in your feed, in your subconscious, in the choices you think are your own. By now, you feel it. That tug beneath your skin, that sense you've seen this before, not with your eyes, but in the hollow spaces behind them, because what began with 3 women in the Maine wilderness has become something more invasive, more intimate. It's in your memories now, and the doctrine isn't satisfied with you. It wants your children. It wants your lineage. Because what Temperance Ashford failed to perfect with metal rods and bone chisels, her ideological descendants are now achieving through curriculum reform, algorithmic exposure, and synthetic spirituality designed to rewrite reality at the root. This is no longer about mind control. It's about soul erasure, a full reset of what it means to be human, driven not by force, but by narrative. And you've already seen it happening. You just didn't know what you were looking at. Let's talk about education. In the early 2000s, under the banner of global competency and inclusivity, education shifted. But beneath the surface, something else moved. Common Core. SEL, social emotional learning. Culturally responsive teaching. They sound noble. They sound progressive. But when you peel back the language, you find a darker logic, the Ashford logic, to remake the soul, detach it from heritage, memory, and myth. Replace these with modular frameworks designed for compliance, not connection. Children no longer learn who they are. They learn how to adapt, not how to think, but how to perform correctness under shifting cultural conditions. Ask a child in the system today who they are. They'll tell you their pronouns, their social identity markers, their trauma categories. But ask them about ancestry, purpose, courage, and you'll get silence. This is not education. It's ritualized disorientation. Just as the Ashford sisters used language and isolation to erase the past from their subjects, modern institutions are erasing cultural memory one standardized lesson at a time. And once a generation loses its story, it becomes programmable. But education is just the foundation. The true reprogramming happens where emotion lives, entertainment. Do you understand how much ritual is embedded in the shows your children watch? The repetition, the symbols, the chosen one myth inverted until the hero is the outcast, the rootless, the identity-fluid cipher, over and over, the orphan, the memory wiped, the hybrid, the broken avatar saved only by the system itself. It's not just coincidence, it's narrative warfare. Because the Ashford model knew this: to conquer a person, do not break their body, break their myth, offer a new myth, and they will rebuild themselves in its image. Look at the highest grossing stories of the last 20 years. Harry Potter, orphaned, trained through an institutional pipeline, defeats evil only by fully conforming to that same pipeline. Star Wars reboot. Legacy bloodlines rejected. The hero is chosen not by ancestry or strength, but by submission to collective will. Marvel. Identity is synthetic, enhanced, deconstructed. Purpose is reactionary. Morality is outsourced. This isn't entertainment, it's preparation, a slow, beautiful erosion of the individual myth. And in its place, a synthetic soul. One that's always seeking permission, always needing validation, always ready to comply. But here's where it descends even deeper, because as identity collapses and myth is stolen, something ancient stirs. The hunger for the sacred. Men have always sought meaning, always pursued the divine. And when that hunger goes unmet through tradition, the system provides an artificial sacrament. It's not religion, It's ritualized emotionalism disguised as spiritual wellness. You've seen it. Mass meditations sponsored by apps with AI-voiced guides. Breathwork healing taught by Instagram influencers who quote neuroscience they don't understand. New Age practices blended with self-help, stripped of lineage, stripped of God, but still promising salvation through self-optimization. This is not awakening, it's control with incense. Because without real tradition, without ancestral gravity, these synthetic sacraments do not liberate. They pacify. They tranquilize the soul long enough for full ideological insertion. And those who resist, they're labeled as backward, as toxically masculine, as threats to progress. Just like the unruly women who entered the Convent of Eternal Tears. Only now, it's your sons and brothers who are being reconditioned. Let's name what this is. It's a new religion, built on data, preached through screens, funded by systems that have inherited the Ashford mantle. This new faith has commandments. You are fluid. You are broken. The system can heal you. Submit to the structure. Questioning is hate. History is suspect. Myth is dangerous. God is within. But only as they define God. It is not faith. It is spiritual simulation, weaponized, designed to feel sacred, engineered to feel profound, but empty beneath. A looping liturgy of affirmations, identity performance, and micro-rituals that never lead to truth, only to dependence. And where dependence rules, freedom dies. This is the final evolution of the Ashford words. Doctrine, not just manipulation, not just coercion, but the construction of a self that loves its cage, where the subject no longer needs to be broken, because he was never whole to begin with. The system made sure of it. Now ask yourself, do you remember who you were before the screen, before the scroll, before the rewiring? Do you remember when you first felt the pulse of real truth? Not just opinion, not just noise, but that deep, terrifying certainty that you were meant for something real. That wasn't a hallucination. That was your soul trying to wake up, trying to fight the spell. And if you're here, right now, then something in you survived, something they couldn't delete. But you have a choice. Ignore this. Let it fade. Go back to the pacification rituals and pretend nothing's wrong, or start the war for your own soul, because they don't fear your opinions, they fear your clarity. They don't fear your anger, they fear your memory. They don't fear your questions, they fear your lineage. Remember who you are. You weren't supposed to make it this far. You were supposed to look away. You were supposed to scroll. You were supposed to forget. But here you are. Still breathing, still remembering, still listening to something deeper than algorithmic noise. Good. Because now we cross the line they fear most. The line where awareness becomes resistance, where watching becomes warfare, where the passive observer becomes a keeper of memory. The Ashford doctrine was never just a tool of control. It was a fire meant to consume identity itself. But fire, as the ancients knew, can purify as well as destroy. And from the ashes of ritual abuse, from the collapsed pillars of corrupted institutions, something is rising. A counter-ritual, a silent movement. Of men, of memory, of blood that remembers. It begins not in cities, but in forgotten places. Places without Wi-Fi, without satellites, without surveillance. There, in forests, on mountains, in abandoned industrial halls, a new brotherhood is forming. Not new, really. Older than the Ashfords, older than America, older than empire itself. It's a reclamation of ancestral rhythm, practices buried, demonized, and replaced by system-safe alternatives. But they're coming back. The fasted vision walks, the iron rites, the blood pacts, the cold immersions that reawaken something primal. Something the Ashfords tried to bleed out of the feminine spirit, and the digital cathedral now seeks to emasculate in men. These practices are not for show, they're ritual reboots of sovereignty. The system fears them because they don't generate data, they generate transformation. And once a man remembers the voice of his ancestors, he doesn't ask for permission ever again. I'll give you a name they don't want spoken. The Ninth Bell. Not a cult, not a religion. A loose affiliation of ex-military, deconstructed theologians, off-grid families and former intelligence agents who discovered something horrifying in their research. All the major control operations, MK-Ultra, Project Monarch, Tavistock Studies, Operation Chaos, were iterations of the Ashford formula. Sensory deprivation, narrative inversion, identity fracture, re-imprinting through ritual. The Ninth Bell wasn't created to fight it through lawsuits or elections. They formed a spiritual counterforce. They studied the doctrine, reverse-engineered it, then built rituals of remembrance. Some call it mind armor, others call it ancestral shielding, but the result is the same. Men who cannot be programmed, fathers who pass down memory that resists erasure, bloodlines that bend but do not break. But understand this, the system knows. It knows who's waking up. It knows where the fractures are forming, and it's moving to plug them. Watch closely. You'll notice increased media attacks on toxic masculinity, on dangerous traditions, on conspiracy communities. That's not because those movements are wrong. It's because they threaten the final phase of control, the one where you surrender your identity willingly in exchange for a false sense of safety. But if you keep your memory, if you keep your myth, you become immune. Because the Ashford doctrine only works on the fractured, not the forged. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat in silence for an hour? No screen, no stimulation, no task. Just you. And the ghosts behind your eyes. Most modern men can't do it. Because stillness reveals what distraction hides. The weight of unlived truth, the echo of forgotten vows, the raw presence of masculine divinity that cannot be simulated or sold. That presence is your inheritance, but you have to reclaim it. No one's coming to save you. Not religion, not politics, not tech, only ritual, blood, and breath. Here's the most dangerous truth I can give you. The Ashford doctrine wasn't fully invented. It was stolen, distorted, built upon an ancient framework used by warrior societies to initiate, discipline, and awaken. The Greeks had it, the Sufis whispered it, the Norse carved it in runes. The early Christian mystics encoded it in the desert. But the Ashfords inverted it. They took the sacred spiral of transformation and turned it into a spiral of fragmentation. Why? Because a fragmented man is profitable, he consumes, he obeys, he performs. But a whole man, he is sovereign. He builds, he leads, he remembers. That's why you're here. Not just to hear a story, but to awaken what the system tried to crush. That deep inner sentinel that says, I've seen the lies, I've walked the fire, and I am not what they made me. The system calls it toxic, but it's the most sacred fire left. And when enough of us remember, the doctrine breaks, the cathedral cracks. And the voice of Temperance Ashford, that cold, sterile whisper still echoing through algorithms and education and entertainment, finally falls silent. You want action? Start small. Sit with your discomfort. No stimulation, no numbing. Let the silence burn the fog away. Find your lineage. Know the names of your dead. Learn the battles they fought, and how you are here because they refused to fold. Reclaim a discipline, physical, spiritual, martial, doesn't matter, but make it yours, something uncolonized by system logic. Say no, just once, to the algorithm, to the trend, to the thing you should do. Watch what happens, and if you're truly ready, initiate another man past this flame, not as content, not as entertainment, but as ritual transmission. That's how the counter-ritual spreads. That's how the brotherhood builds. They wanted you asleep, but you didn't flinch, you didn't scroll, you didn't forget. Now you are the resistance, you carry the forbidden flame, and soon they will feel it. Because one awakened man breaks the system's rhythm, 1,000 become a signal, and 10,000 a reckoning. You think you still have time. You think the storm is coming tomorrow. But what you're feeling, in your nervous system, in your bones, in your dreams, isn't fear of what's coming. It's the residue of what's already begun. Because the Ashford Doctrine was never just a historical horror, it was a template, and that template is now complete. The collapse is not a future threat, it's a designed inevitability. And we're not standing on the edge of it. We're inside the ritual already. Let's start with the obvious. Institutional overload. You've seen it. Across government, education, religion, media, medicine. The flood of contradictions. The lies that don't even try to hide. The policies that cannibalize themselves. This isn't incompetence. It's phase 7 of the control ritual. Total cognitive dissonance. When the brain is bombarded with so many conflicting narratives that it can no longer form a stable identity, it breaks, or rather, it fragments. And a fragmented public is exactly what they want. Because just like the women in the Convent of Eternal Tears, broken by noise, deprived of light, robbed of time, a society under constant narrative assault becomes docile, confused, and ready to submit to whatever promises relief. This is not accidental. This is collapse protocol, the final stage of the Ashford template. A full-spectrum psychological overload followed by a synthetic solution offered by the very architects of the breakdown. Let me show you how the ritual unfolds. Phase 1. Destabilization. They introduce contradictory truths. Trust the science becomes, there is no biological truth. Be yourself becomes, you can choose what self means today. Stability dies. Phase 2. Emotional fragmentation, polarization, manufactured outrage. Each side turned into a cult. Men are turned against their fathers. Women are turned against their nature. Identity becomes performance, not essence. Phase 3. Moral inversion. Good becomes evil. Truth becomes hate. Sacrifice becomes weakness. Faith becomes superstition. Phase 4. Reality fatigue. The constant churn of crises. Pandemics, protests, wars, economic shifts. It never stops. Your nervous system can't track it anymore. Phase 5. Memory burn. History is rewritten. Language is redefined. Even time becomes slippery. A continuous now with no anchoring. Phase 6. The offering. They present the solution. A universal basic identity. Digitally integrated, ethically neutral, psychologically sterilized. Phase 7. Ritual submission. Consent is ritualized through behavior. Wearing, repeating, affirming, not just acceptance, participation. By this point, you're no longer choosing, you're performing obedience to feel safe. This is not theoretical. This is the ritual you're already inside. Ask yourself this. Why are they suddenly obsessed with trust? Trust the experts, trust the system, trust the plan. Trust is the currency of collapse. Because when reality breaks down, they don't need truth. They just need your submission. And if they can't get it from logic, they'll take it from exhaustion. This is why men are giving up, not because they're weak, but because the system was designed to break them. You weren't meant to win here. You were meant to be worn down, fragmented, and return to the altar with a shattered will, ready for the final phase, the integration. What is that? The synthetic self. The final product of over 2 centuries of Ashford Doctrine evolution. No memory, no myth, no roots. Just preferences, inputs, identities assigned by trends. This new self doesn't fight, it curates, it aligns, it submits, it cannot rebel, because it was programmed without a center. And that's the ultimate ritual. Create a generation without a why, and you will never need a weapon. They'll police themselves. But here's the secret they don't want you to hear. Collapse rituals don't just break, they also reveal. If you survive the identity burn, if you endure the fragmentation without clinging to their solutions, something ancient stirs inside you. Something outside the ritual, something older than the Ashfords, older than the system, something elemental. It's the original myth, the soul core that remembers purpose without needing to define it. And that's what they fear most. Not your facts, not your resistance, but your essence. Because if enough men remember that they are not programmable, the ritual fails and the system dies. That's why they've launched the last part of the ritual, mass simulation. Watch carefully. They're replacing truth with simulation in every domain. AI-generated art, synthetic voices, digitally altered history, deepfake spiritual teachers, holographic ancestors. They want you to stop noticing what's real, because reality hurts. Reality demands growth, blood, sacrifice, death, rebirth. Simulation only demands attention, and once you live in simulation, you forget what pain means, you forget what love costs, you forget that death is holy, you forget why you're here, and that's when the ritual is complete. But here's what they never calculated. Some of you would survive the burn, some of you would walk through the fire and come out forged, some of you would refuse the synthetic self and remember the old ways, even if no one taught them to you. Because blood remembers, and blood doesn't lie. That's why I'm telling you now. There's no going back. You've already heard too much, felt too much, seen the cracks in the cathedral walls. You're not safe anymore. Not from the truth, not from what it's awakening in you. And that's good. Because safety is the final lie. Only those who embrace the collapse without surrender can be trusted to build what comes next. So if you feel what I'm saying, if it's not just words, but memory in your spine, comment this phrase below, twice. Blood does not forget. Write it twice. Once for your ancestors, once for your future sons, because ritual requires repetition and transformation demands declaration. This isn't for the algorithm, it's for you. Say it again, now. Blood does not forget. Blood does not forget. And that's why the doctrine will fall. The Ashfords thought their dominion would last forever. Stone walls, sealed rituals, secrets buried in blood. But every system that feeds on inversion eventually collapses from within. Because reality cannot be inverted forever. And every lie, no matter how meticulously crafted, eventually collides with truth. This is the moment the Ashfords never anticipated, the reckoning threshold. The place where trauma becomes testimony, where victims become vessels, where blood, silenced for generations, begins to speak. What the public never knew, what the state buried under layers of red tape, archival mislabeling and missing files, was that the Ashford legacy ended not with a fire, not with a trial, not with exposure, but with a whisper, a single fracture, inside the blood lay in itself. It wasn't Thomas Brewster, or Deacon Morrison, or the reformers that brought them down. It was Temperance Ashford, the youngest, the most beautiful, the most chilling, and the only one who ever broke protocol. In 1824, during what was presumed to be a routine correction of a 17-year-old named Margaret Breyer, a bright, outspoken girl from Boston who had dared to write essays on abolition and feminine autonomy, something happened that no one expected. Temperance froze. She didn't pass the instruments, didn't adjust the restraints, didn't speak. She simply stared at the restrained girl and saw herself, not in body, not in story, but in essence. For the first time in her life she felt rupture. And rupture, as any mystic knows, is the beginning of truth. What followed is one of the most heavily redacted sequences in the Maine state archives. But remnants survive. Burned letters, hidden pages in Temperance's diary, a single surviving witness, Margaret Breyer herself, who would later testify anonymously under the pseudonym Patient X27. Her account is clear. Temperance Ashford didn't just let her go. She unsealed the records. She sabotaged the ritual. She betrayed the doctrine, and with that single act, she collapsed a 26-year chain of control. Because the doctrine didn't rely on brutality alone. It relied on perfect compliance. Everyone had to play their part. Everyone had to protect the ritual. But once a priestess breaks, the energy changes, the spell breaks. The fallout was immediate and silent. No public trial, no national headlines, just a sudden quiet. Patients were returned to families under strange explanations. Authorities arrived and took custody of the remaining Ashfords, and the Convent of Eternal Tears was quietly decommissioned, its land sold, its records sealed in the interest of public mental health. But in private, something far darker occurred. Because the Ashfords were never acting alone, they were vessels, but not the architects. And when the vessel cracks, the architects retaliate. Here's what they don't want you to know. There were 10 sister houses like the Convent of Eternal Tears across the eastern seaboard. 1 in Virginia, 2 in the Ohio Territory, several buried in Canadian wilderness outposts, registered as sanitariums, all with the same design, all funded through church Tavistock partnerships, masked by transatlantic religious charities. Temperance's betrayal triggered a chain reaction. One by one, the other houses began experiencing incidents. Unexplained patient escapes, staff disappearances, fire, untraceable letters of confession, unmarked graves unearthed in upstate forests. By 1826, 7 houses had collapsed. By 1828, only 1 remained. And that one was absorbed into a naval psychiatric institute under full government control. And by 1831, the Ashford name vanished from public record, not through shame, but through intentional deletion. The bloodline had become a liability, and in the eyes of the architects, all broken vessels must be burned. But something else began to stir. Not just vengeance, but rebalancing. Because bloodlines that fracture violently often carry with them a curse, but also a call, an invitation to redemption through transmission. Temperance Ashford didn't vanish. She fled, changed her name, lived among the very women her family once treated, and taught them what had been done to them, taught them how to heal the fracture, how to reclaim this ritual, not to control, but to remember. And she passed that knowledge through story, through touch, through ceremony. That's why the Ashford legacy didn't end. It split. Half into darkness, half into illumined vengeance. And that second half is where we find our inheritance. Because make no mistake, rituals, even dark ones, leave imprints. On land, on blood, on the collective psyche. But those imprints can be recoded, cleansed, rewritten, but only through confrontation. You cannot heal what you refuse to look at. You cannot break the spell if you still fear the symbols, and you cannot walk into your own power until you stare into the face of the system that tried to erase you, and say, "Not again, not me." That is the reckoning threshold, where we stop being victims of history and become agents of ancestral correction, not with violence, but with clarity, with embodied memory, with ritual that restores rather than fragments. The very forces the Ashfords used to enslave, we can use to reclaim. So what do you do now? Here's what they fear most. Speak the names, say them out loud. Agatha, Prudence, Temperance, not to invoke, but to remember who you are not. Unmask the rituals. Every time you see a modern inversion, a therapeutic method that numbs, a healing process that erases identity, name it. Say, Ashford logic. Expose the script. Reclaim sacred practice. Fire, cold, stillness, story. These were never theirs. They were stolen. Take them back. Transmit to others. Share this story, but not for likes or virality. Share it as blood memory, as ritual warning. Because once you do that, you're no longer in the story. You're writing the next chapter, and the system can't touch that, because they only know how to manipulate the past. But they have no idea how to stop the awakened present, and that's who you are now. You've come this far. Not as a spectator, but as someone who felt the chill in the marrow when the veil lifted. Someone who heard something ancient crack behind your eyes. Now we come to the edge of it, not the end of the story, but the place where stories either trap you forever or set you free. This is where most men stop. They hear the darkness, they face the abyss, they feel the call in their blood, and they look away. They scroll to something easier, numb themselves, tell themselves it was just entertainment. But you didn't look away. So now you have a choice. One path leads back into the simulation, the other leads into the unknown, the path of sovereign legacy. Let me make something clear. The Ashford doctrine never fully died. You think it ended in a stone basement in Maine? No. It just evolved. You can see it now in every institution that still uses therapy to sterilize human identity. In every corporate training that strips men of instinct, rage, conviction. In every school where boys are taught to distrust their own strength. In every pharmaceutical solution that turns spirit into symptom. In every algorithm that predicts your desires before you even feel them. That is the digital echo of the Convent of Eternal Tears, sterile, smiling, sanitized. But the ritual logic is the same. Silence the instincts, suppress the deviance, reformat the mind. The modern Ashford doctrine doesn't wear habits and crucifixes. It wears lab coats. It speaks in mental health awareness and diversity training. It claims to care while it neutralizes. And it works. Not because it's stronger than you, but because you were never taught how to see it. Until now. So now the real question, how do you walk beyond it? Not escape. That's cowardice. Not destroy. That's fantasy. But transcend. Walk as a man who sees the code and refuses to obey it. Here are the 3 seals you must break. 1. The myth of safety. The system thrives on one core lie. Obey, and you'll be safe. Safe from pain, safe from exile, safe from judgment. But here's the truth. Safety is the enemy of transformation. Every rite of passage begins with danger. Every man who ever mattered in history, from Moses to Malcolm X, stepped into the fire, not away from it. The Ashford doctrine was built to keep you safe, inside a cage. Break that. Walk into the sacred risk. Speak what you're not supposed to say. Feel what they told you is too much. Let discomfort initiate you. That's how you reclaim the fire. The silence of the blood, they erased your ancestors, your rituals, your masculine grief. They told you, be strong, but meant be numb. They taught you logic, but ripped out your lineage. They made your body a machine. But inside you is memory far older than language. Memory carried in flesh, in bone, in breath. The reason the Ashfords were obsessed with women's minds, because they knew the truth. All blood remembers, and masculine memory, when fully awakened, is unbreakable. So you must learn to listen, to sit in silence, to ask your bones what they've stored, to honor the rage, the shame, the sacred wildness that modern life told you to kill. That's not trauma, that's your ancestral ignition. When you let it burn, not to destroy but to clarify, you become undeniable. 3. The illusion of completion. You want closure. We all do. We want the villain punished, the chapter to end, the wound to heal. But the real truth is, this doesn't end. The system may fall, the institutions may rot, but your work never stops. Why? Because you are now a carrier, not of the curse, but of the correction. You walk into rooms now and change the frequency. You see systems and interrupt them. You speak truth and make people uneasy. And that's the point. You don't need resolution. You need mission. Let the system try to forget. Let the cowards numb themselves again. But you remember. And you make others remember, because blood does not forget. And it never forgives cowardice. So here is your choice, brother. You've walked through 200 years of hidden history. You've seen the doctrine, the deception, the ritual. You've watched the fractures open. You've remembered the names. You've made it through the fire. So now you decide. Do you become a shadow of the system, or do you become a living ritual of remembrance, not to mourn the past, but to build the uncorrupted future? The system doesn't know how to stop a man who walks with truth in his mouth and ancestors at his back. Be that man. Start tonight. Here's how. Write down one lie the system told you and burn it. Find one brother and tell him the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Speak one sentence aloud every day for the next 7 days. I carry the blood that remembers. I carry the fire that purifies. I am the legacy the Ashfords feared, and never again forget who you are. This was never just a story. It was a ritual transmission. And if it spoke to you, not just entertained you, but awakened you, then don't scroll past it. Honor the transformation. Let it mark you. Let it change how you walk. Let it change how you speak. Let it change who you protect and who you confront. Becca, use That's How We Win, not with rebellion, but with remembrance. Now ask yourself, what are you building? What will they say about your name 200 years from now? Will it be erased? Or will it become a symbol of the man who broke the ritual and passed down sovereignty instead? If you've stayed through all 15 sections, comment below, I carry the blood. Let it be your mark, your refusal, your legacy. And if this spoke to you, share it with one man who's ready, because this kind of knowledge, it spreads one fire at a time. Welcome to the lineage, brother. You've earned it. And now, you carry the blood.